This is Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture's Wednesday webinar, Micronutrients. Our presenter today is Jared Miller, PhD, Extension Educator with University of Maryland Extension. A special thank you to our sponsors, Mid-Atlantic Farm Credit, Delaware Department of Agriculture, and the USDA. To view all archived presentations, along with all upcoming presentations, visit our website. Thank you for listening.
All right. So my name is Jared Miller. I'm an extension agent in Somerset County. I have a background in soils. So today's talk is going to be about soil micronutrients. We're going to overview in general what soil micronutrients are, where you'd find them in the soil, and then some ways to recognize them in plant deficiencies. So start off with, you want to understand what an essential element is. It's a nutrient that is required for plant growth. That its omission will cause death or abnormal growth, so that if you don't add nitrogen, your plant might not die if you don't add enough, but you might also have abnormal growth. It can't be replaced by another element. So all of these elements are known to be needed for the plant to have full growth, full yield, or not die. Plant nutrients, you'll notice I put from the soil at the top because I'll mention something else in a minute, but we have the primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, like the NPK fertilizers you can buy, the 10-10-10 or anything like that. We also have secondary nutrients. We consider calcium, magnesium, and sulfur secondary because they're needed in pretty decent amounts but not quite as high, and you can get those out of lime, gypsum, or sulfur fertilizers. And then we have what we're talking about today, the micronutrients, which have slowly been discovered over time as they test and figure out what nutrients might be important, and they're always looking at adding more. There are some that aren't on this list that people look at, like nickel. But we're going to talk about boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc, which are all pretty much agreed to be micronutrients that are essential to the plant. So a micronutrient is, again, it's an essential element, but it's found in less than 0.01% of the plant dry matter. So we need them for plant growth to happen and for yield to be full, but it's not needed in as great amounts as something like nitrogen. And for what I said before, I said nutrients from the soil. There are nutrients in your plant that you don't necessarily add, like carbon that comes from carbon dioxide, and then hydrogen and oxygen, which can come from water, and the oxygen can also come from air. Remember that 80% of the plant is water. So these are important nutrients, but that's what I mean by from the soil. All these other nutrients we talk about, we can add to the soil. This is the average concentration in plant dry matter sufficient for growth. So it's an average across a bunch of plants. Every plant out there will be a little different in what they need. I have all the micronutrients in italics over here. And you can see their concentrations in millimoles per gram. It's just a concentration. So as you go down this list, you increase in your concentration. And it's really easy to point out the difference between manganese and nitrogen because it's 1 to 1,000. So on average, plants need about 1,000 times more nitrogen than manganese. And you can see once you bump up above chlorine, you get to 80 for magnesium, 60 for phosphorus. So these are micronutrients. It's just something you don't need a lot of, but they are essential for plant growth. I know some people don't like chemistry, but just to point out, in these blue circles here, these are all your micronutrients. These right here, N, sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, carbon, these are actually nonmetals. Most of your micronutrients are considered to be metals, except for boron here, which is a metalloid. And then, of course, chlorine's a halogen. So boron, let's go over some plant functions for all these nutrients so you can see why they're important and what they do. Boron, we have some flowering pollen over here. It's the only nonmetal among the micronutrients. It's important in cellular functions. It's essential for pollen germination and growth, and it's essential for seed and cell wall formation. So it's very important in the structure of the plant and making sure you have good pollination and growth. Chlorine is essential for photosynthesis. That's often why we call that yellow tissue you see to be chlorotic. It affects stomatoregulation, which is why I put this bottom of a soybean. This was actually, I'd taken a picture of some aphids for somebody. So the stomates are underneath leaves, helping regulate air coming in and out of the plant. So chlorine helps with stomatoregulation, and it helps raise osmotic potential on your plants. Copper, it's a constituent of oxidase enzymes. It's also the metal component of some proteins, so it helps with electron transfer, kind of chemical reactions going on inside of the plant. Yes, if you look at the bottom here, April, you should see a file. Yeah, if you click on Soil Micronutrients Final PDF, you can download that. Okay, iron. Some important plant functions of iron is important for electron transport in some enzymes. It's also associated with chlorophyll formation. So here's what happens when you don't have chlorophyll formation. Chlorophyll helps make a plant green. Over here you have this yellowing color. So you'll notice a lot of these micronutrients are involved with chlorophyll in some way, and that's why you end up seeing yellow tissues. Manganese, it's involved in the oxidation reduction in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is indirectly related to chlorophyll. So if you have a manganese deficiency, you might see chlorotic tissues. You might see some yellowing. It's a constituent of respiratory enzymes, and it accelerates germination and maturity, which is why I put this picture of corn in there germinating and maturing. Molybdenum, it's very important to the plant if a form of nitrogen be taken up as nitrate. So what it does is it helps convert nitrate to ammonium, which is typically the form that you might find in organic tissues, like in amino acids. It's going to be in this form. So if you were to add urea or ammonium to your soil and you had a molybdenum deficiency, you might not notice it as much. But if you add a nitrate source, or the nitrates being released from organic matter, a molybdenum deficiency might show up in your plant. It's a very important component of legumes, like soybeans here. So inside the nodules, if you have enough molybdenum, it helps them convert nitrogen within the soil to a plant use from the air in the soil. And then zinc, another one that's very important for chlorophyll, given that green color of the plant. It aids in plant growth, and it also improves root development, flowering, and fruit production. So you can see quite a lot of these are involved in chlorophyll and photosynthesis, and others are involved in their ability to move electrons or part of enzymes and other activities within the plant. So where do micronutrients come from? Micronutrients, like a lot of nutrients in the soil, they're going to come from the parent materials that the soil formed from. So bedrocks, like here on the left, they can be nutrient rich. Over here on the right, you have these, here's a sand dune. I like showing this picture just to show you about as weathered and nutrient-poor soil as you can find. You might have a soil that's high in nutrients because they're weathering right out of the bedrock. You might have some sedimentary soils that are very low in nutrients. But the bedrock themselves, depending on the rock type, if you compare granite to sandstone to quartz, this granite, you can see several different colors. These pinks here often indicate potassium. These darker colors indicate magnesium. This sandstone, this red sandstone, is obviously high in iron, but this quartz, which is dominantly silica oxide, doesn't have as many of any of the nutrients that are necessary for plant growth, which is going to be similar to this sandy soil you see here. So your parent materials, your rocks, they can provide micronutrients, but depending on where your soil forms in the state or the region across the country, you might be deficient in micronutrients to start off with. Organic matter, because it comes from plant tissues, can have the micronutrients that the plant took up and recycle them back into the soil. So on the left here, this organic matter that's associated with these roots, as it's breaking down, it might be releasing micronutrients back into the plant tissue. As these roots die in the grasses, they might re-release micronutrients they took up. Any material you leave on top of the soil, and then of course any animal manures that we add could all have sources of micronutrients. So just like nitrogen or phosphorus, all animal manures are going to have different amounts of micronutrients depending on how the animal processes it. So you can add them through organic matter, you can add them through fertilizers, and the organic matter in the soil itself, as it's recycled by microbes, can have micronutrients in it. So then, where are these micronutrients going to be located within your soil? Typically, when we talk about calcium and magnesium and potassium, we say well, they're on the cation exchange. They're on your CEC. They're absorbed with the soil, and they can come on and off. Micronutrients can be there too. They can be on that exchange. Because it's a smaller amount, we don't necessarily include it in the soil test that you see on the CEC. And then it's a good idea to keep in mind that a clay is going to have greater CEC than sand, so automatically it might even be holding more micronutrients, just like any other nutrient. Of course, organic matter can be a source of them, but organic matter can also have CEC, so it can hold on to them. But organic matter also has these ligands and chelating factors in it that it can hold them in different ways. And then you have the solid minerals in soils like clays and oxides. They might have micronutrients in their structures, so they're there in the soil, but they're not necessarily plant available, and this is where pH becomes very important. So CEC, your cation exchange capacity, hopefully you remember this. So your soil particle, it has some charge, it's negatively charged. It attracts these different positively charged ions to it. They can exchange on and off into the water where your root can then pick it up. So zinc, although we don't necessarily measure it on the CEC because it's in smaller amounts, it can absorb to the CEC and come on and off. So CEC is one possible place to find micronutrients. Another one is organic matter, and organic matter can be complex because in one instance I told you, yes, it can break down and release micronutrients in its structure. It can hold micronutrients on its CEC, but it might also chelate micronutrients, making them more or less available. It depends on what they're chelated with and how much organic matter you have in your soil. There's no simple answer to this. Organic matter can help if there's some in your soil, but it becomes detrimental if there's a whole lot, depending on the micronutrient. So the residues over here on the left that you're adding, they're going to break down and release and add micronutrients. The organic matter that's a little older in your soil, it might have organic acids, it might have these, we call them ligands, that can bond to the micronutrient and make it less available to plant uptake. But it also might be an organic acid like fulvic acids that stay dissolved in water and can actually transport micronutrients. So it depends on how old your organic matter is. So the fresher the organic matter in the soil, if you're adding fresh organic matter to it, you usually have more of these what we call fulvic acids and humic acids. If you have older organic matter, it has this material called humin, and it might actually restrict or decrease the availability. This becomes very important with certain micronutrients like manganese. And then these soil minerals that we talk about in the soil. There's that arrow. Got to remember where I put it. So here you have a nice red soil coated in iron. That red coating is around these soil particles. That's an iron oxide. It is not plant available. It's a solid mineral. So your plant's not going to be able to take up that iron. Now plant roots can exude certain enzymes and ways to reduce the iron or make it available to themselves, but it's not immediately available to plant uptake. If your pH drops below 5.0, these oxides, these iron oxides, might actually dissolve and release iron, but of course we don't recommend your pH to be that low. You also have to think about whether or not your soils are saturated, because iron in this oxidized form, iron 3, which is a solid mineral, if you saturate the soil, it becomes soluble iron 2. And you can see right here, this area, this gray area of the soil over on the right, is actually deficient in iron. So what happened was, this was a saturated soil, the iron was reduced to iron 2, it transported over to here, when the water table dropped, it reoxidized and concentrated. So if you have a saturated soil, you might have plant available iron, but do you really want to have a water table sitting up that high? pH controls a lot of what we were talking about with those solid minerals. So this is a typical, you can find several examples of these. Some are easier to read than others. It's nutrient availability depending on what your pH is. So over here we have a very acidic pH of 4 all the way up to a very basic or alkaline pH of 10. And I'm going to skip over all of these, but all these major primary and secondary nutrients are also affected by pH in some way. And I'm going to stick right here in this box between 6 and 7.0 because most of the time we're going to tell you keep your soils between 6 and 7 for your pH. If you keep it above 5.5, if you ever heard about the pH of 5.5, below this we actually release more aluminum into the soil. But we'll talk about 6 to 7 so you can see why we might recommend this range. You don't have to get to a pH of 7 because once you get in this range, you make most of these micronutrients available. So you can see iron, as you increase in pH, drops in concentration. Manganese starts to drop in concentration. Boron drops somewhat. Copper and zinc. Molybdenum is the only one that increases in concentration with pH. So if you stay within this range, you're more likely to have, these are small amounts of nutrients in the soil, so if you stay in the right pH range, you have enough available for plant uptake. If you push your pH above 7, and you already have low amounts of, say, copper and zinc, you're more likely to remove it from plant availability. So pH is important when we talk about those oxides and solid minerals in the soil. So the reasons for pH can be complex, and you don't really have to understand them. Just remember to keep that pH range in mind, and then if you get too high, you lose access. So in some cases, like copper becomes this copper hydroxide instead of free copper. So your plant uptakes this ion. It can't uptake this solid. They might also absorb onto sites and soil minerals and organic matter as the pH rises. Like if your pH gets too high because you've added lime, you have excess calcium carbonates, iron can absorb to that, and then it's not available for plant uptake. So soil reduction state, it's what we call when you have a saturated soil. Because of the activity of microbes in the soil and the lack of oxygen, you have a lot of extra electrons that want to go somewhere. So when you add an electron to this iron 3, it becomes iron 2. So when you have a saturated soil, it can make iron more available, and it can make manganese more available. But then, do you really want to be farming a saturated soil? So while it does make them more available, it's not necessarily an instance. In this case, the soil right here is obviously under forestry. You're not going to want to put these under agriculture if you can help it. But it does make it more available. So where are soils usually high in microbes then? If you have an igneous rock parent material or other rocks high in nutrients. So if you're in Maryland, you would say on the western side of the bay where we start to have more Piedmont materials, limestone, anything, well, limestone raises the pH a little too high, but you have more nutrients in those bedrocks than necessarily over here on the coastal plain. Any clay soil that's going to have a high CEC can store and hold more of those micronutrients, and they might also be found in the mineral structure of those clays. And then soils with high organic matter can add micronutrients through breakdown, but soils with very high organic matter actually might start to limit their availability. So where are soils usually low in microbes? Parent materials that are low in micronutrients, like a sandstone rock. Alluvial sandy soils are automatically going to be low in the nutrients themselves. Weathered acid soils, that's pretty much a lot of the east coast and the southeast. We've had plenty of rainfall over the last thousands of years, where leaching has removed some of these micronutrients. They've leached out and weathered out of the soils. Sandy soils have a low CEC, so they can't hold them. And if it's a sandy soil that's high in like a quartz type sand, it's not going to necessarily have a lot of micronutrients in the mineral structure, say if those sands weather over time to release. And of course, organic matter, it can be a double-edged sword. If you have a highly organic soil, something that's say 10-20% organic matter, you might have more insoluble human material, we call it human, that it might chelate those metals and make them unavailable. So organic matter, in general, you're probably not going to see this unless you are farming something that's in a very wet area or you've drained an old swamp. But it is possible to see that happen. So how do these plants get to all these micronutrients that we have down there? Well, of course, one way is just root intercept. The root moving through the pore space allows it to explore. Now this really helps with manganese, because manganese is typically insoluble. It's typically in that oxidized state that we talked before. It's more available when your soil is wet. So the root is going to find manganese either easier by exploring. Nutrients can also move with water. So boron, chlorine, iron, molybdenum, and zinc, they can all move through your pore space as water moves through the soil. The only one that really doesn't, you can see I put it in blue, nutrients that move from high to low concentration is diffusion. So if you have a very high concentration of these nutrients, they can also move through diffusion. Like if you've ever added a drop of dye to water and watched it spread out through the water, that would be diffusion. So copper is absorbed tightly to the soil, so the only way it's going to be found is if the root intercepts it or if it's diffused. Same thing with manganese. So all these other nutrients, boron, iron, molybdenum, and zinc, they can move with mass flow, they can be caught with root intercept, they can move with diffusion. You're really limited with copper and manganese. So boron, where is it typically found in the soil? It's found in organic residues and it's released through decomposition. It's typically this anion in the soil water, and for what plants can uptake. Because it's an anion, this version, it leaches easily out of the soil, so you can lose boron easily in a sandy soil. Where's chlorine in the soil? Well, chlorine is an essential micronutrient, but you don't really have to add it. If you add potassium chloride to your soil, that salt that you add to your meals at night probably has chloride in it. It's probably sodium chloride, magnesium chloride. Often the matching anion salt to the soil cations that we have. So there's typically plenty of chlorine in your soil. It's an essential micronutrient. Your plant needs it, but you're probably not going to have to add it to your soil. But we do include and talk about it since it's important. Because it's a negative charge, it can leach out of the soil, but there's usually plenty there, so you don't have to necessarily worry about it. Copper, this is the one we talked about before that doesn't move with water. It's basically absorbed with the soil, so it's often bonded to organic soil molecules like humic and fulvic acids that we mentioned before. Plant roots can actually help release some of these type of compounds to help chelate copper and pull it into their system. It doesn't move with mass flow, so it doesn't move with water, so it's strongly bonded to soil particles. It doesn't really move in your soil. So if you've added copper to the surface of your soil, you're not necessarily going to lose it over time. Of course, once again, sandy soils, organic soils are more likely to be deficient. Iron, around here we don't really typically see an iron deficiency, but it does happen more out in the Midwest where you have higher pHs. It's going to be present as either iron 2 or iron 3. So when you get that red color in your soil, you know you have plenty of iron. Iron 2 is easier for plants to take up. They may release compounds to enhance their availability. So a plant root might actually be able to release a compound to take this insoluble iron and turn it into iron 2 and then pull it into their system. So they have ways of getting that iron in your soil. Because most of the iron is insoluble, if you were to add iron, if you see an iron deficiency and add it to your soil, it's likely to turn into that insoluble form. Organic molecules account for most movement, so if it's chelated by this humic or fulvic acid, that helps it move through the soil. It protects it from being absorbed to soil particles, the mineral particles. Manganese has a bunch of different oxidation states. Of course, plants can only take up manganese 2, the one that you would find in the very wet part of the soil. Most of this manganese 3 and 4 are solid minerals, so it can't take it up. It can also bond to organic matter, which prevents uptake. Up to 80 to 90% of the manganese in your soil might be complex with organic matter. It's a lot easier to find a manganese deficiency in your soils around here than a lot of the other ones, because manganese is strongly affected by your pH, it's strongly affected by the reduction state, and it's strongly affected by the organic matter content in your soil. Molybdenum is also an anion, so it leaches from the soil easily. It also absorbs to iron and aluminum oxides, that solid iron mineral that we've talked about past couple slides. Another one you typically don't see, but it does leach out of the soil pretty easy. Zinc is typically found on the soil, CEC, or it's complexed with organic matter, and it's typically in this form, the zinc 2, so it can be uptaken by plants. So just to summarize, and I left chlorine out of here, but your anions, boron and molybdenum, they're more likely to leach out of your soil because they're negatively charged. Copper, iron, manganese, and zinc are all positively charged, so they're attracted to your CEC. They might absorb to oxides, those iron oxide coatings, or they might also bond with organic matter. So then, how do you recognize deficiency in your soils for all these different nutrients? And some of them can be very similar. So in the end, I am going to tell you, if you see a deficiency and it matches several ones, you just take a tissue sample and you send it off for a test. But you want to be able to separate a deficiency from, say, disease in soils. And sometimes you might have both going on at the same time. You might have a deficiency that allowed disease to set in. So if you have a boron deficiency, you might have poor seed or fruit set. You might have breakdown of the growing tip of the tissue, so that meristematic tissue, the freshly growing tissue, you might have it break down, and then leaves might have a scorched appearance. Copper can be a little more likely than boron because it absorbs the soils and organic matter so tightly that if you raise your pH too high, you can see a copper deficiency pretty quick. You can see along the edges here when this soybean plant. Copper isn't mobile within the plant, and we'll talk about that in a second, so you see a stunted growth of new leaves. It's more likely to happen in sandy soils that have a low CEC and where you have organic matter that might bond and hold it. Iron deficiency. Iron is another one that's immobile within the plant. You would typically see what we call intraveinal chlorosis of the younger leaves, since it's immobile within the plant. So you can see stripes like this in this corn plant. Manganese. Manganese and iron in soybeans can actually be fairly similar to each other. This is soybean, different than corn. You don't see necessarily stripes, but you can see in soybeans manganese and iron might look similar as you have this intraveinal chlorosis. So you can see these soybean leaves that have gone through different stages of how bad their manganese deficiency is in one field, from barely registering to actually being necrotic or dead plant tissues. It's another one that's immobile in the plant, so you see it in the younger leaves. You see that intraveinal chlorosis of younger leaves, just like iron. It's more likely to happen on our soil types, though, around here. We typically have plenty of iron, even on the coastal plain. So if you see intraveinal chlorosis, it's probably manganese and not iron. But you can send off a tissue test to be sure. Molybdenum, remember it's involved in nitrogen transformation within the plant. You also see a yellowing of the leaves similar to a lack of nitrogen because, of course, it's involved in transforming nitrate into ammonium, what the plant needs. So you're going to see some similar symptoms to a nitrogen deficiency. It starts in the older leaves first, and it's more likely in a soil with a pH less than 5.5 because, remember, molybdenum is the only nutrient that increases in availability as your pH goes up. And then zinc. Just like manganese and iron, intraveinal chlorosis on the younger leaves. They can be yellow or white. They have this, they call this feathering. You can see some feathering in these corn leaves where you have this, the whiter color. So you have some intraveinal chlorosis right here, and then you have a much more affected area that's gotten white right over on this side. You also have something they call white bud, where the younger buds on plants turn white. So a lot of these descriptions are meant for plants in general, not specifically corn, wheat, soybeans, but they also, this occurs in, fruits, vegetables. So some of these descriptions are general for plants. Just to show you one diagram I found for zinc deficiency worldwide. So we have medium deficiency in our area, which means typically you don't see it. But even in the United States, because of over here in this more desert area, let's say your pH is probably a little too high, we have zinc deficiencies either due to parent material, organic matter. Down here we have sandier soils. And then across the whole world, we have different areas that automatically have zinc deficiency. So these nutrients are a problem worldwide depending on what your parent material is, how much organic matter, what your pH is. It can be very different. So I mentioned a couple times about nutrients being mobile or immobile in the plant and being on younger leaves or older leaves. And this is important because it helps you determine quickly when you're out in the field what nutrient might be the problem, even if the symptoms are the same. So when a nutrient's mobile in the plant, as you get new growth, those nutrients can move to the new growth. So things like nitrate, phosphorus, and potassium, and magnesium, these macronutrients, they can move up through the tissue to your new growing leaves, so the deficiency would actually be in the older leaves or at the bottom of the plant. So for the micronutrients, chlorine, zinc, and molybdenum all can move to new tissues. Immobile nutrients, and I'll just focus on the micronutrients, iron, boron, and copper all don't move. And manganese, looks like I forgot to write manganese in here, but manganese, so you're going to see deficiency in the younger leaves because the first leaves that come out on the bottom of the plant are the older leaves. As their plant keeps growing, those nutrients stay there, so you just see deficiency in the top of the plant. So, and these soybeans aren't deficient in anything, it's just a picture I had from the side of the field. So this new growth at the top of your plant is going to show deficiencies in iron, boron, and copper if you have them, because they're trapped down here in the lower leaves, the first leaves that came out. So whatever iron was present in the soil was taken up into these leaves. As your plant gets older, if there's not enough available in the soil, you see the deficiency up here. And then for your old growth, magnesium, chloride, zinc, and molybdenum, all of these can move up to the top of the plant. So you'll see a deficiency in the older leaves. So when you go out in the field and you think you have some problems, certainly you can grab a plant and take it back with you, but be sure to take pictures of the whole plant and get an idea of where is your deficiency at. If you have an issue in the plant, and if it's disease, you might see it in certain spots too, but you can look at the top and the bottom and figure out, is it the new growth or old growth, and it'll start to help you pinpoint what nutrients might be the problem. And it'll also help you pinpoint what tissue samples to take and send off to the lab for testing. You have to remember with these micronutrients that plant toxicity is also an issue. You need them in small amounts. Soils naturally have low amounts, so you can't just go out there and apply a whole lot of it to try to cover yourself, because the plant can actually have toxic effects due to over-application. So things like boron, copper, chlorine, if you add like the salts next to your roots that can damage plants if you put the fertilizer too close to roots or too high in concentration. If you over-apply these nutrients, they can harm your plant. You can also have problems with pH and soil concentrations or sludge additions. So we naturally have high levels of iron in our soils here, like that red soil. If you drop that pH below 5, you start freeing up a lot of iron, and that iron can then be toxic to your plant. So you can see a complete opposite effect if you go too far in one direction. You can have plant toxicity effects. You can go from deficiencies to toxicities quick with some of these nutrients, particularly things like manganese. If your manganese in the soil is high and you drop below 5.5, you're going to see the same thing. You'll see a manganese toxicity. And you push the thing above 7, you might see a deficiency. Plants are very tolerant of molybdenum. You don't see as much toxic effects from it, but animals might not be. So why you have to keep track of molybdenum and not over-apply that if you think you have an issue is that any animals that eat it might actually take on some toxicity effects. This is not something you need to memorize or know. It's just if you get to the end of your rope trying to figure out what's going on, you should also know that all these nutrients interact with each other. Most elements interact with each other. This list is not supposed to be exhaustive. It's just to let you know how complex it can be. So the first thing you want to do is determine what kind of deficiency you have, and then you try to ameliorate it. But if that doesn't work, you might have different things going on. A lot of different research has been done, has seen things like that manganese can limit iron uptake because they have a similar charge. Remember, they're both +2. So they might limit each other depending on what their concentration is in plant uptake. Higher levels of calcium have been seen to limit iron uptake. Copper has been competitively limited zinc uptake because they both have a similar charge, +2. But zinc has also improved the uptake of nitrogen, magnesium, and copper. So I have books and notes that seem to contradict each other about what happens when, depending on the plant. Don't memorize this. Don't think you have to know it. Just if you continue to have a problem and you can't figure it out in the field, know that there might be something deeper going in there that you have to look at. More than likely, it's a simple deficiency, and you can fix it with an application. Pesticides can also mimic damage from nutrient uptake by damaging how the plant uptakes. And this is actually a cornfield that the tank was probably not completely cleaned out. the pesticide residue that was left damaged the plant, and then it mimics like an iron deficiency in here, inside the tissues. So keep in mind when you see a deficiency, look and see if it's got a, if I showed you a background picture of this, you can see a square, and you can know, if you see straight lines in a field where there's a problem, then it's probably man-made. If you see straight lines in a field that are nutrient deficiency, it could be over-application of lime. It could be pesticides not properly cleaned out of the tank. If you see things that seem natural, like round shapes in the soil, things that follow the landscape, that's more likely to be natural within the system. So you can often tell when it's human error or human problems by the straight lines you see in a field. So what's the best way to manage micronutrients? Of course, you can do soil testing. You can remember to start off with that you're more likely to have deficiencies on a sandy soil or a high organic soil. If your organic matter is 1% or 2%, you don't have to worry about it. Really, when they're referring to this, they're talking about swampy soils, 10%, 20%, really high organic matter. And at the same time, remember that those organic soils might be breaking down and adding nutrients. A basic soil test is going to give you your phosphorus and potassium. The more expensive test will give you micronutrients. So if you have a garden, it's not a bad idea to pay for that $18 sample and go ahead and give yourself the full range. If you're doing 300 to 1,000 acres, you might actually want to watch and see if you have a deficiency. Know, okay, my soils are sandy, my pH is too high. Watch and see if there's a deficiency, and then test that area. Test the plant tissue and test the soils. You don't want to just go out and assume that you have to pay for that expensive test, because most of our soils probably have plenty of these micronutrients over here in Maryland. Like I said, manganese is a bigger issue for most people. And watch for the issue and then address it. So different ways that you can apply micronutrients. You can broadcast them. The problem with broadcasting them, since you don't really need a lot, it's not the best option. Most application rates are under 10 pounds an acre, so it's kind of difficult to evenly apply it. You can mix it with granulated or liquid fertilizers, and you can also have coated granules. But again, since we don't apply so much of it, it's not always the best option to just broadcast across the whole area, especially if just certain parts of your field have a micronutrient issue. Banding is a great way to do it, placing it alongside the plant where the roots can reach it, so you concentrate the micronutrient where it's needed the most. And then, of course, the foliar application later in the season, once you see that there's a deficiency, when you see the symptoms appear, you could go out and do a foliar application. Often, by the time we see it, there's damage being done to your plant before you see symptoms. Just like with people, if we're lacking a certain nutrient or certain care in our health, you might start having problems long before symptoms appear. So sometimes by the time you get to seeing that manganese deficiency, it might be too late to go out there, and the application might not be cost-worthy. So that's why you have to keep in mind, what was my pH, what was my soil type, do I need to watch for this up front? I say often what you're really going to be doing is looking at the problem and fixing it for the next year. And then you can also, if you're adding any organic materials, and manures, sludges to a certain degree, will contain different amounts of micronutrients, as well as those other organic fertilizers like seaweed or fish meal. They're all going to have micronutrients associated with them. So if you're allowed, based on your nutrient management plan in the state of Maryland, to add organic materials to your soil, you're probably, through things like poultry litter and cow manure, adding some micronutrients as you go anyway. So when is foliar going to be a good idea? So when the amount of the nutrient needed is small, when you don't need a whole lot added to your soil, when your deficiency in the soil is small, because you need less foliar than soil applied. If you're going to need a lot to make up a deficiency, it's better to apply it, say band it within the soil, because if you apply too much to the plant tissue, that foliar application, you might damage it. You might also have to go out and do, say, 2 applications of manganese. In some cases, that's what's recommended, to do 2 applications of manganese during the season. And do you have the time or the money or the equipment to do that? In that case, you might want to soil apply it. When you need the nutrient later in the season, if you apply if you see that you have a manganese deficiency and you have the ability to go out and add it to the soil, it might not be there in time, so if you do a foliar application, it's pulled through the plant tissue and it can use it immediately when it needs it. So we've talked about chelation with organic matter. So what do they mean by a chelated micronutrient? It's similar to how organic matter would work. You have this molecule that can hold the micronutrient. Chelation means claw, so think of like a crab claw. It has all these different things we call ligands, like your fingers, grabbing on to that nutrient. So a chelated micronutrient, it's bonded to that organic material. It doesn't necessarily get taken up and absorbed to the soil. It might not be affected by pH strongly, so it doesn't become a solid. So by adding chelated micronutrients, we're slowing down the conversion. So like I told you before, if you add iron to your soil, it might quickly convert to a type that you can't use. It might become a solid iron. But if you add chelated iron, it's more likely to last longer for the plant to get to it. So it protects the nutrient from soil chemical or biological reactions, so it won't convert into an insoluble solid or be used by microbes. And, of course, a chelated micronutrient might also absorb through the leaf tissue easier. So what should you do about micronutrients? First off, I showed you 6 to 7 because a lot of people push there. But if you're on the coastal plain and you have very sandy soils, we actually might say you're okay at 6 or less. If you go below 5.5, you start seeing aluminum toxicity. If you go below 5, you see iron toxicity. So if you keep your pH between 5.5 to 6.5, you're probably not going to see a problem with micronutrients. Up to 7 is okay if you're on the western side of the bay and you have clay soils. If you push it to 7, you might still not see a micronutrient deficiency. If you have a sandy soil and you push your pH to 7, you're very likely to have at least a manganese deficiency. So University of Delaware, they're going to recommend that a sandy soil, pH is 6.0, and if you have a clay soil, you can push it to 6.5. So if you know your soil pH and your texture, you can kind of keep track of your micronutrients without even testing. If you only have a few soil samples, like I said before, if you have a garden, if you have a couple acres, well, you can go ahead and pay to see the whole suite of soil nutrients. You can look at what your micronutrient concentration. If you have 1,000 acres, it's not necessarily worth the money to do that until you see a problem. So if your acreage is larger, know your soil types. Where do you have sandy soils? Do you have organic? Do you have a lot of clay? Look for where those deficiencies might be. Watch for where you think it might happen, and then you can sample the tissue and do soils tests and figure out if you have a problem. Sometimes it might be too late in the season, but you can still alleviate it for the next year. This is a field in Somerset County where lime was applied. The pH quickly went up to 7, and across the whole field, you see all this yellow color, it had a manganese deficiency. It also had some issues with potassium and copper, because potassium wasn't affected by the pH. He was just low in potassium. So there's probably some confounding factors in here, but it was definitely deficient in manganese. The plant yielded very low, I think 20 bushels or less he got off of this field. But he went through that fall or the spring, and he did some tillage, and he mixed the soil to get that lime down deeper and even out the pH, and it alleviated the issue. I didn't make it out this year to get a picture, but his yields were back up around 50 bushels in the soybean, and he didn't see these manganese issues. So you might recognize this. Look for it. We did samples, we did tissue tests, we did soil tests, we figured out what the problem was, and we fixed it for the next year. At this point, it was too late to do a foliar application. But this brings us back to, in this field, how difficult these interactions are within the soil. You might not necessarily always figure out what's going on. There might be several factors. Right here we have, I pointed out these drainage ditches. For some reason, along the drainage ditch, there wasn't a deficiency in manganese. Now, I don't know what happened to this field during the year. I don't know how wet it was, how wet the drainage ditch was, whether it was a redox reaction, whether it was a reaction with the lime that went in the soil. I actually didn't notice it till later in my photos that I could have taken a soil sample here and taken a look. But just know then in some cases it's really hard to figure out what's going on in the soil because there are way too many factors happening at once. Okay, I think I did it about on time. Are there any questions? Because you can't really cover everything about micronutrients in an hour. If you have a micronutrient problem, there are plenty of fact sheets and information specific to that that can talk to you about what type of fertilizer you might use or what your soil level should be.
Thank you for watching our archived presentation of our Wednesday webinar. If you would like to see more archived Wednesday webinars, please visit our YouTube channel, or to find a schedule of upcoming live webinars, visit our website.